Welcome to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. Today, our topic is creating winning cultures, building and maintaining an optimal culture for teams and individuals. Here to have this conversation on culture with us is Ms. Christina Zorn. Christina, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Christina is the Chief Administrative Officer of Mayo Clinic, which has a global workforce of more than 82,000 employees and cares for over 1.3 million patients each year from all 50 states and over 130 countries. In partnership with President and CEO John Rico Ferrugia, Ms. Zorn provides leadership and oversight for Mayo Clinic, and she's been tasked with transforming healthcare for patients at Mayo Clinic and around the world. She began her career practicing law at Foley and Lardner and transitioned to Mayo Clinic in 2002, where she served in a variety of leadership roles at the highest level in both Florida and Minnesota. So, welcome to the project, Christina. We're really honored to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here.
So, to get started, I'm going to lay out the three big questions that we're hoping to answer over the course of this session. So, our first question: what exactly is culture and why is it so critical to success? The second question we need you to answer: how does culture impact behavior and outcomes at work and at home? Our third question: what steps can I take to contribute to a positive culture in the workplace and for my own personal development? So we'll dive right into those. So why don't we just start from the top and tell us, Christina, how do you define culture for a group?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Culture, I think, means a lot of different things to different people. But when I think about culture for a group, it's really the culmination of our shared values, behaviors, attitudes, and priorities. It's usually defined by spoken and sometimes unspoken rules for a particular way of life and, frankly, how we live it.
I love it. I love it. And I think within that, everybody sort of looks at it differently and has different key components to how they define it. So, can you tell me, in your mind, what are the essential elements that shape the culture for an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I'd really refer to four basic things when I talk about essential elements for an organization's culture. The first is shared values, right? So every behavior decision that forms the foundation of a culture, it's really those values to ensure that we're working towards the same goals. And number two is going to be that, right? Shared purpose. A clearly defined shared purpose really can be a source of pride. It can be inspirational. And at the end of the day, it's what keeps your people engaged around a singular idea. It's unifying. The third one is what I would call a sense of belonging. It's something, frankly, at Mayo Clinic, we focus on a lot. And it's born from feeling part of a group and then contributing to something that's bigger than yourself. And then finally, the final element I would say is a sense of psychological safety. So when people feel safe and they're not afraid to speak up, they can share ideas, they can take risk, and they can make mistakes. Those are all things that are essential to innovation and really having a positive culture.
That's great. That's fantastic.
So, Chris, let me ask you a question then. A lot of times when people talk about culture, they always harken back to Peter Drucker, who's the famous management consultant, educator, author. And you probably know he's famous for saying culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, I mean, essentially, he's saying you can have the world's greatest strategic plans, but without a culture that supports it, you're never going to be able to achieve what you want to. What do you think about that?
I love it. I think that Peter Drucker's almost sort of become famous. Like this is his moniker of him as a human being. This quote is sort of what he stands for and what he believes in. I love it though, because I think that oftentimes people get confused and they think culture and strategy are the same thing. But I think this really highlights that they are two very completely different entities. And the way I think about this is I see culture as sort of the foundation. It's the default setting or it's sort of the baseline where people should be starting from. It's automatic, it's enduring. If you do it well, it becomes the habit. It's habitual. It's sort of what you fall back to. And it's your sort of grounding truth. So it's sort of a foundation or a launching pad that everybody stands on, so to speak. So if you do it right, it becomes passive. It's the baseline. It's the norm. It's normal. Strategy, on the other hand, I think is much more active. It requires forward energy. It's really where you're trying to go and what you're trying to achieve. And I think because of that, it's very dynamic, and it requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of planning, and it actually changes quite a bit over time based on the environment, your situation, your circumstances, your goals. So strategy changes quite a bit, and it needs to. But you'll never really be able to hit that strategic target that you're shooting for if you're standing on a foundation that's not solid and not well rooted in culture. So I think if the culture, the foundation is shaky underneath, it's going to be very difficult to launch off to hit that strategy. So that's how I view those two. I think they're very different, both critical to success, though.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, I think the word foundational was really important that you said when it comes to culture. And I think, if culture is really the foundation and pretty much everything you build upon, I'm curious what you think about what a leader of the group can do intentionally to craft and maintain the culture that they really want to enable.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think as you mentioned, one of the key components to culture are really both spoken and unspoken. And I think a leader, whether you're a leader of a large organization, a small team, your family, whatever, it's your role to do both of those, the spoken portion and the unspoken portion. The spoken portion meaning you have to articulate what the culture is, what the values are, what the mission is, so everybody understands and is on the same page. But you also have to do the unspoken part, which means you have to live it out yourself. You have to be consistent with that behavior in your actions and your decisions and what you do. And as the leader, you have to do that not only for yourself, but you have to help facilitate that in others. So when you see other people doing it, you have to do the work to call them out and say, "Hey, great job. That was consistent with our culture and here's why." Because that's how you reinforce the positive behavior. The more challenging part, though, is that the leader also has to call out the individuals who are not behaving consistent with that culture as well. So it's sort of a two-edged sword. They have to do that, but do it in a way that is appropriate and can kind of help redirect that individual back to that culture.
Yeah. So, when we think about kind of calling out people who are not aligned with the culture and personal stakes for doing that, I love this movie, but it just comes to the forefront of my mind when you talk about that. And it's the movie Remember the Titans,
I
which
love
again,
it.
right?
I
Based on a
love it.
true
I love it.
story.
Yes.
I mean, if you're ever feeling a little rocky about your day and what you could accomplish, like turn on that movie. And most people who haven't seen the movie, they're like, it's a football movie. I'm not really into football. I mean, I don't know who's not into football, but if they're not into football, they're thinking, not the movie for me. But the movie's truly about changing culture, right? It takes place in 1971, backdrop of very racially charged Alexandria, Virginia, where they were starting to integrate the schools. And the culture originates first as an all white football team coached by a very esteemed coach on the verge of being inducted into the high school Hall of Fame. Then he's replaced by a black coach, Herman Boone, who wants to entirely change the culture from really what's a I would describe as a competitive, slightly arrogant, entitled one to one that places all the value on hard work, respect, and integrity. Who doesn't love Denzel Washington? But he's Boone. He's the leader that really causes huge discomfort on the team because he has to call out the people that are not aligned with what he believes the culture should be. Ends up, removing some of the team members who don't act the way they do, make racially charged comments, etc. And, you kind of fast forward through the movie, tons of hard work, friction, gets to a place where the guys on the team not only set aside their differences and work together to play the game, they really learn to appreciate their differences. And that includes the difference of the color of skin. And I mean, again, in that setting, very, very significant and pioneering. And their skin color does not have to be a reason for division. So, hopefully I'm not ruining the movie for anyone, but they not only win the championship game, right? But it's this true story of a band of brothers who come together, really pioneer among racial differences, demonstrate respect, and truly protect each other for a long time. But to me, it's like the epitome of culture shift and what you have to go through to really get to the other side, including, huge personal responsibility of very uncomfortable moments where it's forming connectedness and unity in a time of separation.
Mm. That's fantastic. I love that example, and it's fun. You can watch it from the perspective of the coaches and think about their role as leaders, but you can also watch it from the perspective of the individual football players, and you see on both sides of the situation how some of them struggle. They each have different reasons for struggling, and those that finally come along and start to understand and buy into the culture, and those that don't. So it's a lot of fun to watch the individual journeys with that culture as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And obviously, Chris, you know sports well. You play a lot of different roles, parent, coach, etc. The individual roles without a formal leadership role is so important in culture. So, what are some of the things you've seen where individuals, again, who don't have formal leadership roles do to help really define and almost propagate the culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a common mistake that people make is thinking that if they're not the leader or the boss or the executive or the one in charge, that they can't contribute to the culture. And it couldn't be any further from the truth. And in fact, I think everybody, regardless of their position or their title, has leadership responsibility. And that's not only how you lead yourself, that's also how you lead people around you, your peers or your coworkers. If you have people lower than you in the hierarchy, those folks, but also sometimes leading kind of up the chain of command as well. So I think leadership happens from everybody in all directions, regardless of your role and responsibility. And I think that really those individuals have to take the same approach that we mentioned earlier for the leaders. You have to do the spoken part, you have to reinforce the message, and then you have to live out the behaviors that are consistent with that culture as well. Not only in yourself, but also you have to see it in others. So I really think that the role is not that different for someone, for an individual, even if they're not the leader or the CEO or the person that's in charge of that organization.
Yeah, no, I agree. And sometimes the more difficult thing is being the first follower, as you know.
Mhm, mhm, yeah. Well, and speaking of difficulty with that, you mentioned earlier that one of the key components of culture is a sense of belonging or psychological safety. I've been in a lot of different environments across different industries and with different roles and very different cultures. And so I've been in some that did a really poor job of creating that sense of psychological safety, and everyone was really afraid to speak up and contribute. So clearly, that's not good. That's not ideal. That's pretty obvious. But I've also been in some environments where the sense of psychological safety could almost stifle innovation and motivation to challenge the status quo. People felt so safe that they just sort of were maybe too relaxed at times. So is that possible? And is there a balance that we need to strive for? And if so, how do you find that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I've experienced seeing those environments as well. And you kind of talked about two environments. The first being where people are just really scared to speak up, fear of retaliation, being excluded, right? And I'll just use healthcare in those type of environments where people are afraid to speak up. That's where you see things go really, really wrong, right? With quality, staffing, just an overall environment of mistrust. And again, in healthcare, where it truly is life or death, that's where you see really poor outcomes and things happening. Now, the other you talked about where people feel a little too safe and everyone speaks up. And many times what they're doing is defending the status quo, right? They're ensuring we preserve the quote unquote culture, which really means they don't want to change things. They don't look for the curiosity and the opportunities to make things better. I always say both are actually toxic cultures, in my opinion. Now, I know that might be an outlier opinion, a little bold there, but they're really both toxic cultures because the first one, nobody's speaking up. The second one, everybody's speaking up, and you're not going to get progress or movement. So, Mayo Clinic, for example, we 160 years of history, and we stand on the shoulders of all of the giants and the legends who came before us. But we also know that if we don't continue to be curious and improve and learn, then we're going to rest on our laurels and we won't be in a category of one because people will innovate and they'll progress around us. So we constantly have to improve and we have to learn and embrace change, knowing that we really want to transform ourselves and healthcare for the better. And so I think you have to be mindful of both toxic environments. And, I know I feel a responsibility every single day of kind of balancing and respecting the tradition, but also making sure that we have the outliers who speak up and really challenge us on what culture, quote unquote, culture is to make sure that we're moving forward in the way we can.
Yeah, very good. And I think expectations, I think, play into that a lot. So I think those have to be clearly articulated so people know what's expected of them. And we say, hey, maybe you are a part of a great culture, a great institution, but we still, as a part of that, we still expect to get better. That's part of the goal. So we're not passive, we're not relaxing, we're not resting, we're not just riding this wave of success. We're going to keep innovating, we're going to keep moving forward. And I think in those particular circumstances, you really have to be clear about setting the expectations up front so people understand that. But that can be challenging at times.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's especially challenging, right, for a group, right? It's one thing if you have like an individual or even a family or just a small team, but say you're in a large organization or a group, it can be really, really challenging. And that's why, trying to predict or correlate what success is going to look like for a group can be really difficult. But I do think culture can do that. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, I don't think you can do it without culture. It has to be a culture that's well articulated, well understood, with very clear expectations. Because if everybody has their own definition of success, they're all rowing the boat in a different direction and you're not moving forward. On the flip side, though, if you can get everybody in the group and everybody on the team rowing in the same direction and they're all founded under the same culture that has those four essential elements that you listed earlier, that is a synergy magnet. That's when synergy starts to happen. So 1 plus 1 no longer equals 2. 1 plus 1 equals 3, or it equals 4. And I don't think that you can get that synergy unless you start with that firm foundation of culture with all of the key elements that you listed.
Yeah. So essentially, you're saying, the sum is better than its parts. You go together, you're going to go further, faster. Totally agree. Perceptics, the State of Employee Listening Report, surveyed 600 enterprise level organizations and found that organizations that regularly listen to and then, of course, act on employee feedback 3 times as likely to meet or exceed their financial targets versus those who don't, right? These organizations, for example, are also 10 times as likely to achieve high levels of customer satisfaction, however you define your customer, 11 times more likely to have high employee retention, and 20 times more likely to say that they adapt well to change. Which I think, if you've got a culture that enables all of that stuff and you're thinking shared purpose, sum is greater than its parts, right? Then you're going to have all of these better outcomes.
Yeah, and to me, a company that is surveying their employees, that is taking that feedback and is trying to act on it, that to me, that sounds like a company who is trying to have a shared culture that is clearly articulated and communicated and making adjustments based on and feedback from their employees. So they're clearly striving for that to try to get folks on the same page. And I think there are clear benefits to doing so.
And it's so funny, Chris, because there's like organizations you and I both know where they will kind of propagate individualism, right? Like they're superstars. And, there's a ton of companies, for example, that will use performance bonus, things like that to say, no, we want you to exceed and be our superstar versus saying, no, we all participate. We want you to individually be a talent, but you still have to work as a team. And, I'm going to go back because obviously I like movies, I like TV too. So, one of my favorite TV shows is Ted Lasso. You have to watch Ted Lasso, right? Are you a fan?
Pers- Personal hero of mine, Ted
Okay,
Lasso.
okay. Yeah,
Personal
we
hero. Yeah.
love Ted Lasso.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I'm mentoring colleagues or some of my team members, like I will assign Ted Lasso episodes to watch because it's so relevant to like corporate culture, how to play well in a team, how to use your individual characteristics, but still do things that are for the betterment of the team. And one of the actual Ted Lasso episodes that I refer to often is towards the end of the first season. Ted doesn't really understand in true expertise all of the basic technical components of the sport, but what he's trying to do is establish a culture, right? Positive reinforcement, kindness, trust. The sum is more important than its parts. So he encourages the players to think of each other as family and really prioritize collective success over personal glory. And it's that episode where Jamie Tart, who is a well known ball hog, bit of an egotist, has the chance to take the winning shot. However, after really starting to embrace and believe in the Ted Lasso approach, he chooses to pass the ball to Stan, who really has a better chance of scoring. So Jamie makes the decision for the greater good of the team. And then, of course, you'll see in the next season that he really becomes almost an undeclared leader and model of the culture for the team.
That's fantastic, and I think I'm a huge Ted Lasso fan. I think we all have those, Jamie Tarts in our life, and hopefully we all can find some Ted Lassos to have in our life as well to help us on this journey. So speaking of kind of the individual versus the group, I think that it's tough and it is a fine line because obviously there are clear benefits to the group when culture is well defined and healthy. I also think though, as a result of that, there are benefits to the individual that can be a part of that group culture. So can you tell me a little bit your thoughts on how does culture predict or correlate with success for the individual that buys into it for that group?
Yeah, so I think there's both external and internal measures, right? From the external perspective, there's work recognition, there's individuals' involvement, engagement, there's consistency, there's productivity. But when you think about kind of internal measures for the individual, it's their motivation, it's their own satisfaction, whether they feel like they belong, whether they feel like they're psychologically safe, and how they contribute. And, to me, one of the best examples of positive culture that really correlates with success for an individual is Taylor Swift. Now, I'm going to disclose I am a huge Swiftie. So I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit about Taylor Swift. And you can cut me off when you want, Chris, but I got to go here because
I'm fully
we,
supportive. Go for it.
okay, love it. Right. So, look, she no matter if you don't like her music, you don't agree with her politics or social stance, everybody has to agree she is a hard working success, right? She's a great story writer, she's very talented musician, but what she has built is a very unique and dedicated fan culture. She's made herself accessible. She's created this environment of empowerment, humility, empathy for others. And I mean, it epitomizes belonging, right? If you're a Swifty, you're Swifty for life. So her community of fans plays a huge role really in her career, her status as one of the most influential artists of the modern era. And she's a master culture creator. And if you look at the back to individual, she's benefited wildly. I think it was just stated that she had her Eras tour was a $2 billion tour. She actively communicates with her fans. She responds to their comments on Instagram. She sends them personal gifts. They tell her stories. She's philanthropic with them, and she's created this culture of community and inclusivity. And you think about what she's created, and really her benefit has been for her to be able to stay relevant and even beloved for decades, no matter when she switched genres and styles. So to me, she's just the perfect example of individual benefit that's come out of an extremely positive culture.
I've never thought about it that way, but I agree. Actually, as you were saying that, I was thinking about it, and it is such an incredible example because she has sort of transcended a very long period of time. She's crossed over multiple genres of music. She's clearly changed her style. She's changed her approach. She has evolved, but she's also built a culture in an environment that I think would be incredibly difficult because here she is. She has a circle of friends and family around her who she knows personally and interacts with. Then she has fans that she sees in person at concerts, and then others that she only interacts with online. So it's all of these different people, and her fans span all ages and types and backgrounds. So it's all sorts of different people who interact with her on all sorts of different formats for different periods of time for different reasons. I mean, this is a very challenging set of people to get to come together and define a culture with. So if she can do it in that environment with those circumstances, it makes you think it shouldn't be that hard when we're doing it within a team or an organization where we're supposed to all be on the same page and in the same building at times too. So that I haven't thought about it that way, but that is a phenomenal example. Well, let me talk a little bit about, so that's an example of a phenomenal culture. So let me flip that a little bit. What are some of the negative consequences you've seen for groups that had a more toxic culture? We started talking about that earlier, but we didn't get too far into the toxic culture. So tell me some of the problems with that you've seen over the years.
I mean, at the surface, I would say it results in lack of transparency, mistrust. You've got staff that leave, you can't retain your staff. You have unhappy customers because any discord within your teams always, trickles down to customers. But I mean, you think about at its very worst, it can have serious regulatory legal consequences. Like take Theranos, for example, and its leadership. I mean, this is a well-known story, right? Theranos was on the cusp of becoming a tech darling. Founded by a very charismatic Stanford dropout in 2003, promised to entirely revolutionize healthcare and blood testing and the vast industry of medical diagnostics. The media just narrowly, like directly focused on its leader and never the breadth of the team or the bigger purpose and what they were trying to accomplish. And then only later, right, in October of 2015, the truth came out. Theranos was a fraud built on deliberate fabrication and hype. The leader ran the company by message of their former employees who said it was an entirely dysfunctional corporate culture of secrecy and fear. And the staff claimed that those who raised concerns or objections were usually marginalized or fired. So, no psychological safety, no sense of belonging, focused entirely on one individual, and they never had a shared purpose.
Yeah, it's a very good example, and I think too that that shows sort of the extreme or the dark side of when culture goes wrong, kind of at its worst. So we've talked a little bit about um, organizations and individuals that do this really well. Mayo Clinic, Taylor Swift, Ted Lasso, doing it very well, sort of at one extreme. On
I
the other
like the
end,
company of Mayo Clinic there. I
yeah,
just
yeah,
want to
I
know.
think so. I think
I'm
it's a
feeling
fair
pretty
grouping.
good about
It's a
that.
fair grouping. And then I think on the other end, how you have groups that end up with their leaders being convicted and going to jail. And so, but what about the folks in the middle? Because I do think that there's a large, it may be a bell shaped curve, and that the majority of folks in organizations sort of sit in the middle where it's not great, it's not terrible, but maybe it's just not well defined and it's not well established. And if you ask people that are part of that team what their culture is, they'd say, I'm not really sure. I don't really know what we stand for. This is kind of what it feels like, but I can't clearly articulate it. What would you say to those groups?
Yeah, what I would say is you may be causing unnecessary confusion and inconsistency, right? If you don't have a shared purpose or shared values that everyone knows, people are going to struggle to make decisions or take actions because they don't know what they're aligning with. And if you don't have people that understand expectations or a bigger purpose, they're not going to feel connected to something bigger than themselves. And honestly, I think what happens is they become less motivated. So you kind of hear about gig mentality or quiet quitting or things like that. That's, I think, the kind of things that really happen when you don't have a culture that's well defined or established.
Yeah. Earlier, we talked about culture sort of being the foundation of an individual or a group or an institution. And I think that sometimes when the foundation is rocky, the house collapses immediately. But other times it's slow creep. And you don't always see it right away when you have to step back to look at it. And I think that that can be very common. That's sort of exactly what you're talking about. Let's talk a little bit more about, let's say, if somebody finds themselves in a situation where they notice members of their team or their group are not living consistent with the culture, don't understand it. What advice would you give to that individual who's trying to live out that culture but is having a hard time because maybe their teammates or coworkers or family members are not being consistent with the culture?
That's a really good question because, first of all, you have to have the presumption that people understand what the culture is. So, again, they know those spoken and unspoken rules. And then if people see, okay, but I've got people that are not aligned and they're certainly not acting consistent with what we understand to be the culture. I mean, what I would recommend is first seeking to understand, right? Start with a direct, private, but compassionate approach and try and understand why they're taking the position they are, acting the way they are. I always say try and assume, benign intent. People's intentions can be good, but they may just not understand how they're being perceived. And then if it gets to a point where you have to really explain the repercussions of that person's actions, just personalize it to yourself. So say, I'm feeling uncomfortable because when you do this, it seems really contrary to what we're trying to accomplish. So help me understand XYZ. That usually is the best approach that I've seen and works a little better with people that you're trying to understand why they're acting the way they are.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that that job is made easier for that individual if the organization or team has done a good job of setting that cultural expectation so everybody understands it.
Yeah, completely agree.
We talked about Mayo Clinic's culture a little bit, and it's an older organization with a long tradition. I think that there can be pros and cons to tradition as it relates to culture. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I agree, right? Tradition can be so helpful if it's a good tradition and it's healthy. So you've got a shared sense of history, it can promote stronger sense of belonging, and if you have a shared narrative, it can strengthen ties to one another, bring you closer. But if your traditions are outdated or even toxic in the sense that they marginalize people, they're exclusive, they're not inclusive, it really can be a hurdle to progress, can prevent positive change from happening. People use it as a defense mechanism and say, we can't change because this is tradition. So it's not open for discussion. Yeah, if people use tradition not to embrace positive change, I definitely think it can be a derailer for the individual and for the organization. So, as you mentioned, Chris, at Mayo Clinic, a lot of our tradition is based on what the original doctors Mayo and the Sisters of St. Francis brought to us, right? Their legacies, the cultural traditions that originated have enriched the life of our institution. We get our values from them. And we have based, things like our values council, who kind of remind us about how important our values are, and then also help us tell as we kind of embark on our strategies how our values and our traditions tie into the things we do today. So they're constantly modernizing them and making them relevant to the actions and decisions we're taking today. So to me, that's positive tradition as long as it has kind of a future facing perspective and lens.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, and speaking of the future, obviously the world is changing, the landscape is changing, and we have to change with that. So, what are some of the modern threats that you see to a healthy culture?
I love technology and I love that information is real time available. But I have to say that social media has really forced us into what I believe are unhealthy comparisons, right? I've got a daughter. Everything's available now. You never know if somebody's being transparent on social media or if they're using filters, giving a better picture that's possible. And it really forces you into what I believe are unhealthy and perhaps unrealistic comparisons. So, I mean, technology is here to stay. There's a lot of positives, but it can also cause disconnection because there's a lack of real human interaction. Another thing that's come up, again, modern threat is political polarization, right? So, I think if you don't really seek to understand where somebody else is coming from and you label and say, nope, I am on this side or I'm part of this group, it's going to cause division and distrust. So I think these are some of the things that really can threaten kind of a healthy culture and growing and being able to come forward to where people feel like they can belong. And so, as an organization, we have to watch out for that. Things like remote work, things like, are we keeping our employees connected enough? Are we talking about politics at work? Those are all modern threats that I think as an organization you have to really, really be mindful of.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. And I do think that our modern world has forced us to kind of see things as all good or all bad. Sort of this dichotomous, I'm on this team, I'm against that team. And we're sort of everybody's choosing side when things are really a lot more nuanced with that.
Agree. There are so many shades of gray. And I think if we listen and understand, or at least seek to understand, you can find commonalities where you think there were none.
Yeah, very good. Well, tell me a little bit, some advice for all of our audience. How can I, as an individual, tell if the culture that I'm a part of my group, teamwork, organization, et cetera, aligns with my personal values?
So, what's interesting is I have to imagine that as new grads are looking for employers today, right? This may be the question that they're asking. I've been thinking about this as an employer who hires. I'm like, how am I going to make myself relevant and portray what our culture is to someone that I'm looking to hire? So it's an eyes wide open, right? They want to come in to our organization because they believe in our shared purpose and our values and they feel like they belong. And as an employer, I want to be transparent about who we are and what we offer. I was trying to think about this as the potential candidate, right? I first want to make sure that I have a pretty good understanding what the group or organization culture is. That means that I really need to do my prep and my homework, go online, read what other people say, the good, the bad, the ugly, and get a fair assessment to kind of understand what's real and what's not. And then if I don't understand it, I think I need to ask enough questions that align with what resonates with me personally to say, okay, what do you prioritize as an organization or group? And does that make me feel like I could be a part of that, that I want to buy into that culture? So it's not just me, contributing individually, but I feel like I can add something. And I feel like my additions would be valued. Then I think, you talk to others in the group, you kind of suss out whether people are acting consistent with what they say the words are. So it's not just a mission on the wall, but it's things that you see every day, it's how decisions are made. And then most importantly, if you find a culture that doesn't align with your values, you need to opt out or you need to make a change.
Mhm. That's great, and I think sort of what you're highlighting is that there is a culture for the group or the team or the organization, but then there's sort of also this set of values or culture for the individual that's a part of that. So I wondered, I kinda think that each individual person may have their own culture that they believe in and embrace. Is that true? So does culture exist on a small scale, just at the individual level or maybe the family level?
Oh, absolutely. Right. Like our families have culture. We've met other families where we're like, yeah, our family could vacation with that
Right,
family, right?
right.
And then you're the other ones. You're like, okay, how long
No,
do
never.
we have
Yeah.
to stay,
Right,
right?
right,
Like,
right.
those discussions. But it's not necessarily like an ethnic, religious, or national culture kind of definition, but you know your family's values, your friends' values, and well, I'm a huge advocate of seeking out diverse experience, diverse opinions, etc., because you don't want to surround yourself only by people that think like you. You want to be curious, etc. You also have the ability to assess and say, yeah, the values are aligned here. And, I know you're a parent, I'm a parent. And one of the times that, just as an example, where it's not an easy assessment is like when your kids find new friend groups, right? And you're trying to understand, like, are they seeking this friend group because it aligns with what we've set forward as our family values? Or are they going through a chapter where it's like the rogue child, teenage
Right,
years, and
right.
they're like, I'd like to find something very different,
Yes,
and
yes.
I'm gonna experience something that is very different than what I was raised with. And I want to try that for a little bit. And so, as parents, we go through this and we're trying to tell our kids, like, stay aligned with your values, stay aligned with your culture.
Mhm. I love that, and I think that we often think about the organization who needs to be very proactive and spend a lot of time, effort, and energy in defining what the culture is for the group. But in reality, we should be doing that as an individual. And I think that we really don't do much of that. A lot of our culture for our individual, our own values, ends up being just kind of what happens. I don't know that we do a good enough job of actively thinking through that and refining that and defining it. So, would you have any suggestions for somebody who says, how do I, as an individual, define my culture for myself? And then how do I live it out?
I would say you got to look in the mirror first, right? Examine, reflect your own values and beliefs. Make sure you have a good understanding of what those are. Sure, you're going to live your life, different chapters, they may evolve, but really you should have some core values and beliefs that you want to live out and you want people to say, yep, that's who Chris is. That's who Christina is, right? And then I think it's also important to look critically at how you're spending your time and seek out experiences that nurture the culture that you desire, right? If they are aligned with your values, your beliefs, then you're going to have your work, your hobbies, your social interactions kind of aligned with those things that you believe. And so, I think it's really interesting to do that individually. And then I'm a big proponent of microcultures. And, you have cultures, but you, again, because I like diverse opinions and I want to make sure I'm not surrounding myself by kind of a homogeneous thinking, I like critical thinking. That's where I seek out microcultures, right? I want somebody who, for example, is going to disagree with me politically, not at work, but politically, because I want to be educated on why they think the way they do. And again, I want somebody, for example, who loves a sport that I haven't been introduced to and seek out a microculture there and be educated about that. You're not, I would say, you're not challenging your values. You can find microcultures where your values are still aligned, but you've got a lot of diversity and experience and thought. So I think that's really important as well.
I think it's great. And honestly, I think we've lost a lot of that in our modern society too, because social media and advertisers and so many people have designed their systems to keep feeding us the thing that we already like and believe in and ascribe to. And so when we do that, we aren't challenged. We don't see different perspectives. We don't see different visions. And so we become very passive and we just continue to reinforce that message rather than actively taking agency over this and defining it for ourselves. So I think that's absolutely critical. Well, Christina, this has been a great discussion, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to kind of wrap up here with a few of the key take home points for me, and then I'm going to hit the three big questions with you again to get your thoughts. So I've learned a lot here. I think for me, sort of the big take home points. One, the four essential elements of culture that you listed. I really like those. First one being shared values. Second being shared purpose. Third being the sense of belonging, and the last being that sense of psychological safety. And I think culture consists of both the spoken and unspoken components. So you have to verbally define it. You got to write it down. You got to tell people, but then you also have to live it out as well. And I like how you talked about it existing at both the group level and also the individual level. You really have to do that unspoken part and living it out at the individual level to actively seek and try to cultivate it. And then also the thing we talked about and where really anybody can influence culture within an organization with a family, regardless of what your title is. In fact, you are the culture of that organization. So everybody should feel a sense of shared responsibility in this. And then Lastly, the ability for synergy and success. So if you can get this right, your success and productivity and everything else we talk about on the human optimization project are going to get better, and it's all interconnected. So those are my main take homes. And I'd like to run our three big questions. I'm going to run them by you real quick to get your final thoughts. So our first question was, what exactly is culture and why is it so critical to success?
So, speed answer: culture is the culmination of beliefs, values, attitudes, and priorities, right? It's going to affect how we think and how we act. And I would say it's the foundation for a positive environment and the catalyst for fulfilling our purpose.
Excellent. Our second question was, how does culture impact behavior and outcomes at work and home?
Well, because as we talked about, culture influences how we think and act. It shapes how we make decisions, how we interact with others, and approach our opportunities, and more importantly, our challenges, both at work and at home. A strong culture is always going to ensure that we're productive in ways that help us reach our own goals. But a weak culture, on the other hand, is going to leave us feeling disoriented, unmotivated, and certainly unfulfilled.
Excellent. And then our last big question of the day, what steps can I take to contribute to a positive culture in the workplace for my own personal development?
So take the time to develop your individual culture and understand your work culture, your home culture. Recognize how they complement one another. Be intentional so that everything you do embodies these values and your culture. And then recognize others for their unique contributions to your shared culture.
Great. And obviously, this is a big topic, and we talk a lot about a lot of big topics on the Human Optimization Project, but we want to give our audience the highest leverage items that they can really focus on. So, what do you think are the biggest levers that they can pull to become culture creating masters themselves?
Yeah, so I would say what you mean, role model the behaviors that you want to see in others. Second, stay curious, right? See new things, meet new people, and seek out new perspectives. All of those things are going to strengthen your own culture. And then I'd let people who live out the culture know that you believe in knowing how much you appreciate them, right? You're reinforcing that culture.
Great. Well, to help reinforce that and to put it in practice, we're going to give you the call to action or the challenge after this one. So we have two things for you on this episode. One is focused more on the workplace or team environment. One is for an individual. So for the workplace, what I would challenge all of our audience to do is sit down and write out the top three things that you love about your work environment or team or group or organization. Just pick three. Then think about at least one person that you interact with who embodies each of those attributes, and then go tell them and watch what happens. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You're going to find yourself reinforcing that culture, and you'll see good things that'll happen. And then in addition to that, I'd like you to sit down and write out in one sentence, keep it simple. How do you want to be known by others? In essence, how would you define your own culture for yourself that just like Christina talked about? And then once you have that determined, write out three things that you're doing in your life currently that are consistent with that statement. Try to do more of those things. And then write out three things, people, activities, or habits that you're doing that are not consistent with that statement and that individual culture. And then see how you can either minimize those, reduce them, or eliminate them. So that's something you could do. It won't take much time, but that'll get you an easy win moving forward in this progress. So, optimizers, there you have it. Miss Christina Zorn just took us through this session, creating winning cultures, building and maintaining an optimal culture for teams and individuals. She easily helped us tackle the three big questions and set us up in an excellent call to action to go put these principles into practice. Thank you so much for having this conversation on culture with us today, Christina.
Yeah, truly my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It was fun to be here, talk about some of our favorite shows, and of course, cultures.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And to our audience, thanks for joining us. As always, remember to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be and never stop optimizing.